Growing up, kids very rarely understand why their parents do what they do or why they have certain rules in place. But as they get older, they usually tend to find out why those rules were put in place. And for the two brothers in today's story, they very quickly found out why their dad's love for the outdoors was completely shattered pretty much overnight, and why he put rules on them when it came to the outdoors, when they too had their own absolutely terrifying experience that completely devastated their love for the outdoors as well. But before we get to that encounter, if you've had an encounter or know a story that you'd like to have shared here on the show, please email me at the link below. If you like today's story, gently slap that like button. If you haven't done so already, especially if you're a return viewer, hit that subscribe button. While you're at it, lock up that notification bell so you don't miss out on any future content. Now, let's get into today's encounter. Growing up in northern Minnesota, twin brothers Nick and Dustin were brought up from a very young age to have a very strong respect and love for the outdoors. Pretty much from the time that they learned how to walk, they were out hunting, fishing, and camping with their father and along with their uncle. They were taught how to shoot at a very young age, and very shortly after, they started joining their dad and their uncle on small game hunts for rabbits and grouse and squirrel. And they wanted to, when they got older, be just like them. They had the utmost respect and they just absolutely idolized their dad and their uncle. And they just thought that those two men were just the greatest outdoorsmen ever. As they got a little bit older, coming to the mid 90s, their father actually ended up buying about 640 acres of land up in northern Minnesota that was completely surrounded by public land. The only way to get into this property was to park on the side of the highway. There was a bit of a dugout through the ditch, a little driveway that went into the bush. They'd have to park there and then walk about 2 miles to get to this property. Now, Nick and Dustin, they were still pretty young at this age, so their dad and their uncle would not let them join them going onto this property just because of the walk that they would have to do through just this incredibly thick bush surrounded by low wetlands, and it just was not safe for these two young boys to be venturing through terrain like this. Nick and Dustin did not understand why they were never allowed to go to that property, and that year in 1996, in the fall, during that year's deer season, their dad and their uncle were supposed to be going on a week-and-a-half long hunting trip out to that property. Nick and Dustin, they both pleaded with their dad to let them go, but their dad just told them, "I'm sorry, boys, you're too young and it's just not safe." Nick and Dustin obviously were very let down by this, but because they looked up to their dad so much and had such a respect for him, they figured if dad's telling us that it's not safe, he has his reasons, and they just kind of accepted that. So when it came time for their dad and their uncle to head out to the property, they waved goodbye, and they were expecting to see them again in about a week and a half's time. However, the next day, their dad and uncle showed up back at the house, and their dad looked very shaken up. He did not look normal how he normally looked when he would get back from hunting, and they knew that something was up. Just because their dad was supposed to be gone for a week and a half and the next day showed up back at the house, but their dad would not tell them why they came home. He just said that he was finished with hunting and that he was never going back to that property. And staying true to his word, for the next 2 years, they barely did anything outdoors. They did not go hunting. They barely went fishing. When they would go fishing, it was always somewhere populated and not off the beaten path. And the boys, they really had no idea why kind of their life had been turned upside down, why they no longer did the stuff that they had grown up doing and the stuff that they loved to do. So they asked their dad and their uncle multiple times, asking them what's going on, like what happened, why don't we go do these things anymore? And their answer from their dad and uncle was pretty much always the same. They were told, don't go deep into the bush, stay where there's people and stay where it's safe. The boys, they really did not understand that. However, once they were about 13, so about 3 years after that incident, they very slowly started hunting again with their dad and uncle. but they would go nowhere near that property, or for that fact, even nowhere near that part of the state. As the years went by, come about 2013, the brothers were now 30 years old. Their dad and their uncle were well into their mid to late 50s. Their dad and uncle pretty much stopped going hunting and fishing almost altogether. They were getting a little bit more up there in age, and they did not really have the energy to keep up with the boys. So just over time, they kind of just very slowly stopped going altogether. So come 2013, the brothers were really looking to try to go out to that property that their father had purchased when they were kids. So they started asking him, hey, Dad, could we go to the property you bought? You know, we know you still have it. We know you didn't sell it. Like, would it be okay if we went out there, maybe set up a deer camp? You know, it'd be a great place for us to go, private land. We won't have to deal with public land anymore. And their father was very hesitant to say yes. Eventually, though, their dad did tell them yes, but told them that they had to be incredibly careful, that there was something out on this property that was not right. It was something that he just could not explain, but he told the brothers, like, when you go there, you have to be on high alert. Keep your head on a swivel. Just be prepared and be ready for absolutely anything at any time, and never go there alone. The brothers were pretty confused by that, so they asked their dad, like, hey, Dad, what happened to you and Uncle when we were kids? You guys went out, you came back the next day, and you've never gone back. Their dad said it was a long time ago. I'm sure whatever was out there is long gone. Boys, just be careful and don't go alone. The brothers kind of took that with a grain of salt, but they were incredibly happy that they finally got to go out to this property, and they started making plans on how they would set up a primitive deer camp, and they were making plans for seasons well into the future. Their first trip out there was well before season. It was late August. They, just like their dad and uncle, they had to park in that little drive through the ditch. They made that 2-mile walk through the bush up to this property. They found this big clearing. It was probably about 75 to 125 yards round, and they figured this was the perfect place where they could set up this deer camp. So over the summer, they basically cleared a bunch of trees. They used the logs from these trees to build their camp. They ended up building this big lean-to. They ended up building a big A-frame where they would be able to hang deer from to process them. And they came up with an idea that they would leave all their essentials there, their cooking equipment and stuff like that, in these big metal waterproof bins. And that way they would not have to carry stuff all the way in every time they would go. Now, they were a little concerned about bears getting into their equipment, so they came up with this idea that they were going to put these large bins up in this one massive tree, and they were going to basically chain it to the tree. And to prevent bears from getting up to this bin, all along the bottom around the trunk of this tree, they put bear boards. What a bear board is pretty much a sheet of plywood with a bunch of nails that stick up out of it, so that if a bear steps on it, the nails go into its foot, and it'll kind of back off and just leave whatever it is in front of them alone. And come that fall, at the start of gun season for deer, the brothers were going to head out to the property for their hunt. However, Dustin was not able to get the first couple of days off, so that meant Nick was going to be going out to the property completely by himself. Nick and Dustin talked about it a little bit, and Dustin told Nick, you know what, I'll drive you out to the property, I'll drop you off, and then I'll meet up with you in a couple of days. And that's exactly what they did. They loaded everything up into Dustin's truck. Dustin drove Nick out to the property, dropped him off, and then Nick made his way through that 2 miles of really thick, dense bush out to the property where they had that camp set up. As Nick was getting closer to camp, he noticed in that clearing where that large tree was, right by the lean-to, right by that A-frame, where they had that metal bin hung up in the tree, it just did not look right. It looked like the ground all around the bottom of that tree was just kind of all ripped up. And he noticed that that metal bin was no longer suspended in the tree. Nick's first thought about this was that a bear somehow flipped over all of these bare boards, climbed up in the tree, knocked this bin down to the ground. So he made his way towards this tree to kind of get a better look. Once he got up to the tree, he noticed that all those bare boards that were scattered all along the bottom of that tree were still there. The nails were still pointing up, but that bin was absolutely nowhere to be found. He ended up spending about 20 minutes just kind of looking all around the property, around where their camp was set up, to see if he could find this bin, and he actually ended up finding it just inside the bush line about 75 yards away, and it was just completely mangled. It was all kind of crushed in on itself. It was ripped open. Their cooking utensils, their cooking equipment was kind of all scattered all through the bush. Nick really did not know what to make of this. He just basically stood there looking at all of their stuff just strewn all through the trees, and he actually ended up saying out loud, "What the hell? An animal doesn't do this." And his thought at this point was that somebody had come on the property, they vandalized the bin, dragged it into the bush. But the more he started thinking about that, the more it really, that too did not make sense. He was thinking, like, why would somebody come, pull this thing down, drag it into the bush, beat the crap out of it, throw everything everywhere? Like, some of that stuff was worth a fair bit of money, like their camp stove, their lanterns, stuff like that. And it didn't make sense that they would do that, but not trash the A-frame or trash a lean-to. So it really left Nick at a little bit of a loss for words. But he figured, you know what, I'm going to gather up and salvage what I can, and I'm still going to try to make the best out of this trip. You know, when Dustin gets back, if we need to replace something, we'll drive into the nearest town and get it. So he gathered up everything that he could. He took it back to the A-frame, and then he spent the rest of that late afternoon kind of taking stock of everything, finding out what was damaged, what was salvageable, and what needed to be replaced. Once he was done going through all that, he set his bed up inside the lean-to, then he got a fire going outside. That evening, right as the sun started to go down, he was sitting by the fire making some food, when all of a sudden, off in the distance, he heard this real deep guttural howl that sounded very similar to a wolf howl, but at the same time, it sounded very different as well. And when he heard this howl, it almost sent like a chill all through his bones, and he was almost immediately filled with this feeling of dread. He immediately quickly sat up, reached over, grabbed his rifle, held it close, just because this howl gave him such a weird feeling. It sounded like nothing he had ever heard before, at least not typical of wolves in that area. He ended up sitting there, clutching his rifle closely, just kind of looking off into the dark. And periodically, over the next 10 minutes, he would hear that same howl. And it sounded like each time it was getting closer and closer towards where he was. After a little while, though, Nick figured, you know what? I'm going to throw some more wood on the fire. I'm going to keep this fire raring all night. And I'm just going to go sit inside the lean-to. I'm going to keep my rifle close. You know, I've been in the woods many times. I grew up in the woods. I'm not scared of any wolf. So that's exactly what he did. He threw a bunch of wood onto the fire. He went and tucked himself into his lean-to with his rifle very close beside him as he lay there in his sleeping bag. He ended up drifting off to sleep. The next morning, he woke up to his little pocket alarm clock, waking him up about an hour and a half before dawn. He got up, he had some food, then he made his way into the bush for the morning's hunt. And all through that morning's hunt, he just kept replaying that howl in his head, just thinking about how it just did not sound like any wolf he had ever heard before. And it did make him feel pretty uneasy being all alone in the woods like that. However, later that morning, all of a sudden he sees something moving through the trees, so he quickly grabs his rifle, gets it ready, just in case it's a deer. And sure enough, it was actually a pretty nice buck. So he took the shot, dropped this buck. Then he spent the rest of the morning and well into the early afternoon field crossing the deer and then dragging it all the way back to camp, almost 3/4 of a mile. Once he got it back to camp, he actually struggled a little bit to hang it up in that A-frame, but once he got it all hung up, he ended up making a fire. Then he just sat by the fire for a couple of hours, just relaxing and recuperating from that drag. About an hour before sundown, all of a sudden he could hear something moving in the trees, making its way up towards camp. And again, just because he was so on edge from that howl the night before, he quickly grabbed his rifle, holding it like this, holding it ready, just kept thinking about that howl the night before. So he's looking over into the bush, not knowing what he's going to see come out of it, when all of a sudden he sees Dustin coming through the trees into the clearing. He kind of breathed a sigh of relief. His brother had showed up at camp. He was actually showed up early. He was not expecting him till the next day. So when Dustin got up to Nick, Nick told him all about the howl the night before, showed him the deer he shot. Dustin congratulated Nick on this really nice buck. And then the two of them, they sat around the fire, they made some food, and they just kept talking about this howl that Nick heard the night before. At about 10 o'clock that night, the two brothers made their way into that lean-to. They settled in for the night. And at about midnight, Nick was woken up by the sound of something walking outside of the lean-to. It sounded like it was walking around the right side of it, making its way towards that large tree where that metal bin had been. Nick immediately reached for his rifle. He shook Dustin awake and said, "There's something outside." Dustin, at this point, he too quickly sat up, starts looking outside the lean-to for any sign at all of what Nick had heard. The two brothers sat there, their focus just hyper-focused on where that tree was, listening for any movement or looking for any movement at all. After a few minutes of not hearing or not seeing anything, Nick said, "You know what? It was probably just a rabbit. It was probably just a squirrel. I'm just letting my imagination get away on me. Everything's fine. Let's just go back to sleep." So the two brothers, they laid back down. Nick leaned his rifle up against the side of the lean-to, and they ended up drifting off back to sleep. The next morning, they woke up to their alarm clock again about an hour and a half before sunup. And when they got out of the lean-to, the first thing that they noticed was that buck that Nick had hung from that A-frame the day before was just gone. There was a rope dangling down, but that was it. The two brothers, they kind of looked at each other like, where the hell did this deer go? And they just stood there for a few minutes, just in shock. Nick at this point's like, what the hell's happening? Like, did a bear come into camp? Like, is that what I heard last night? Dustin's like, well, if it was a bear, I'm pretty sure we would have heard it. It would have made some type of noise as it pulled the deer down. You know what? Let's just wait for first light, and we'll see if we can find where this deer is. If this was a bear or some type of animal, it would have dragged it into the bush. We'll follow the drag marks, and we'll get to the bottom of this. So the two brothers, for the next hour and a half, close to 2 hours, waiting for it to get full on light outside, they ended up making a fire. They stood by the fire. Both of them are pretty on edge, so they just stood there with their rifles, waiting for the sun to come up. Once it was full on light outside, they made their way towards the A-frame, and they did notice that on the ground right below where that deer was hanging, there was a deep impression on the grass, and they noticed that there was a big drag mark, big bloody drag mark, dragging away from the A-frame towards the bush, not too far away from where Nick had found that big metal container. The two brothers, with their rifles in hand, followed this trail up towards the bush, and they actually continued following it for about 300 yards through the trees as it kind of made its way zigzagging around the trees and going through tall grass. After about 300 yards, they ended up coming upon remnants of this deer, but it was not the full carcass. It was like little bits and pieces of it just scattered all along the ground, like an animal had actually feasted on it. It was almost like a pack of wolves had just tore into this deer. So at this point, that's exactly what they thought happened. They thought, somehow some wolves came into camp. They somehow pulled the deer down. They dragged it off into the bush. And we somehow, I don't know how, did not hear any of this. But this is the only thing that's making sense, just based on what we found here. So the two brothers kind of feeling a little depressed at this point, because now Nick had used his tag on this buck and they have nothing to show for it, no meat to bring home from it. They made their way back to the camp. The rest of that day, they hunted pretty close to camp. They were both still a little on edge just because of what had happened to this deer. They knew now that there's most likely wolves in the area, and they really did not want to separate from each other too much. That evening, again, just like the night before, they made a fire. They ended up sitting around the fire for a bit. And while they were sitting around the fire, it was about 10 o'clock at night, all of a sudden they heard that same howl that Nick had heard that first night. But this time, this howl was a lot closer. It only sounded like it was only a couple hundred yards away. And when they heard it, it was like the sound just kind of reverberated through their bodies. Both of them were immediately just chilled to the bone with this feeling of dread from this howl. It did not sound like a normal wolf at all. Plus the fact that this howl was just a lone howl and not a chorus of howls like you would normally hear from a pack of wolves. The two brothers, they kind of just sat there holding their rifles close, listening and looking off into the darkness, waiting for another howl or follow-up howls to indicate that, it's more than just one wolf. They sat there for a few minutes when all of a sudden Nick feels Dustin slapping him on the side of his arm. Nick looks over and Dustin's just pointing off to the right. He's not saying a word. He's just pointing over towards where that big tree was. Nick slowly turned his head, looked in that direction, and standing right by the base of this tree, he sees these two glowing amber eyes about 4 feet off the ground, looking directly at him. These eyes were forward facing. They were fairly far spread out, about 4 feet off the ground, and they just kind of sat there staring at these eyes, when all of a sudden these eyes slowly lifted up off the ground to a height of almost 7 feet. The two brothers just kind of sat there, eyes wide, looking in that direction, just completely shocked at what they're looking at. And Nick, basically just out of like an instinctual reflex, grabs his rifle, swings it around, and fired a shot up into the air to scare this thing off. As soon as his rifle rang out, those eyes dropped back down to about 4 feet, and they could see that whatever this was, just based on these eye shine, that it turned and headed off into the dark. The two brothers sat there looking at each other, completely terrified and completely confused at what they just saw. And Nick says to Dustin, he says, "What the hell was that?" And Dustin's like, "I don't know." He's like, "I think it was a wolf. I'm not too sure, but like those eyes just lifted up off the ground." Nick's like, "Do you think maybe it stood up against a tree?" And Dustin's like, "Well, it had to have. There's no way that a wolf's just going to stand up like that. So that's had to be what happened." The two brothers, after talking about this for a couple of minutes, that was the conclusion that they came to, that this was a wolf. When it saw them looking towards it, it just kind of stood up, paws up against a tree, just like a dog will do. And that's why these eyes raised from 4 feet to almost 7. But at the same time, that would just be an absolutely massive wolf. The two brothers, shortly thereafter, they made their way into the A-frame, tried to get to sleep, but both of them are really having a hard time falling asleep after seeing that and after hearing those howls. But eventually they did fall asleep. A short time later, just like the night before, Nick heard something moving around on the outside of that lean-to, and again he just reached over, quickly shook Dustin awake. Two brothers instantly sat up. They had their rifles ready. And this time, though, Dustin, too, can hear this sound moving behind that lean-to. And it sounded like whatever this was really heavy. And it sounded like whatever it was walking on 2 legs. Just the way that these footfalls were falling, it sounded bipedal. They're sitting there clutching their rifles, listening to this thing move around the back of the lean-to, up towards the side, and it was like they were both just completely frozen in fear. They could not even bring themselves to turn their heads to look in that direction, so they're both sitting there looking in that direction with just their eyes, when all of a sudden they catch movement, step out from the corner of the lean-to. It was like in that moment they both just kind of snapped out of it. They shot their heads to the side, looking in that direction, and they see these two large, muscular, hair-covered legs that bent backwards just like a dog, and this large tail. Both of them at this point, they're even more terrified, looking at what's in front of them, when all of a sudden this thing leans forward onto all fours. Except when it leaned forward onto all fours, it was not like when a dog stands up on its back legs and goes down to all fours again. It was like this thing bent at the waist and put arms down onto the ground. They could see these long, muscular arms, long fingers that looked like they had these big claws off the ends of them, and it puts his hands down in the dirt. Now they see this thing's head. This thing's head looked very similar to a wolf, but absolutely massive. They're looking at it when all of a sudden it turns its head and looks right at them. It had these bright amber eyes that were kind of glue looking right at them. Both brothers are just staring at this thing in front of them. In their minds, they're thinking like, this is not possible. This thing should not exist. When all of a sudden it let out this absolutely guttural growl that they could just feel resonate through their entire bodies. It was so loud that once it stopped growling, like almost immediately, they were almost like filled with tinnitus. They had this ringing in their ears as soon as this thing stopped. As soon as that growl stopped, this thing just jolted back up onto two legs, turned, and the next thing Nick and Dustin knew, their lean-to was just collapsing down on top of them. Before they knew it, it was like everything just kind of went black, almost like they had either got knocked out by the debris or they had just passed out because of fear. But the next thing they knew, it was daytime and they were underneath all the logs and all the branches of their lean-to. So the two brothers, they kind of dug themselves out, looked at each other, and it was like both of them were thinking the same thing. Both of them in their heads were like, holy crap, like, did this actually happen? Was this just a dream? Like, there's no way this happened last night. They ended up talking about it, and they came to the conclusion that there's no way this was a dream because they both remembered the exact same thing happening. The two brothers, they wasted no time. They just grabbed their rifles, grabbed their packs, and they booked it all the way back to Dustin's truck. When they got back home, they talked to their dad and to their uncle. They told them what they had experienced on this property and asked them like what they had experienced. And it turned out what their dad and their uncle experienced on that property years before was not the same type of creature that the brothers had encountered, not this Dogman type creature. What they had come across on this property was some other type of creature that his dad just could not fully explain to him what this thing was. Just that whatever this thing was, it was incredibly tall, it was very skinny, kind of pale in appearance, but that he too had heard those real deep howls the night before. Both Nick and Dustin are left with a lot of questions after this experience because what they saw does very closely match the descriptions, pretty much exactly, of a lot of Dogman encounters, but what their dad and their uncle saw is something completely different. So it's left them with a lot of questions of, are there two different types of cryptids on this property, or is this some type of entity that can change its appearance? Is this something completely different? Because when they woke up after that lean-to had fallen on them, they had no physical wounds on their heads that would have explained them getting knocked out by the logs falling on them. So they wonder if whatever this was is just something completely different altogether. Well, that's it for today's encounter. I'd really like to know your thoughts on this one. Please let me know. Do you think that they encountered a Dogman? Do you think that they were knocked out by the falling wood from their lean-to? Do you think that they passed out from fear? Or do you think that there's some other type of entity that they encountered on this property? But as always, thanks for joining us. If you haven't done so already, hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you next time.